These are kind of like gestural sketches in a way. Like for character designers, sometimes like what they'll do is they'll go into like a figure drawing session and there might be like a person that's wearing like a costume that, or they might just even be nude in a pose that's cool. Like it might be like whipping around a sword or something. And they're just doing like 2 minute gestures and they have like an impression of like a cool pose. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll take that sketch, throw it into Photoshop, and then go over it and refine it and make a cool character out of it. Yeah, like one of my buddies, he was actually my professor in college, but that was like one of the ways we would warm up for his classes. He would have us all pose with different types of props, and we would just do really quick, like 30-second to 2 minute figure drawings of each other. And, by the end of it, we would scan those things from our sketchbook into Photoshop and we would come up with like creatures or characters or um, would like force us to take that sketch and make it something final. But that's why I suggest getting a sketchbook. Like, as one, you can get a bunch of different thumbnails, and sometimes that's what it takes to get a good comp. Is doing a bunch of this. I know Edgar Payne, he had his students do like at least 40 thumbnails before they were able to have like a composition approved for a final painting. Um, how true that is, I don't know, but I want to believe it. So I do feel like it does take a little bit of time to go through that process of elimination. Sometimes people will, they'll just like start designing something, or they'll start just sketching one thing and then designing it in full. It's like, oh, like you should have maybe spent more time in the design stage, like figuring out stuff and iterating and playing around with shapes and ideas before you committed, because you lost out on a bunch of potential ideas for like, that could have existed. And now you got something that's like not as refined, and you're, while you're working on it, you're going back and forth. And it gets a little sloppy versus like what I'm doing right here. So I'm just kind of planning some stuff out, just planning shapes. And even in the blender portion too, I'm sure some of these shapes won't be the same, but the overall composition, it'll carry through. And that's like the one tricky part about using new tools is you might have a really good sketch in your sketchbook or something done in Photoshop, but you try to translate that into 3D and your shapes start falling apart, like your composition starts making less sense. It's not because like the idea is lost on you, it's just the tool is a little bit too hard for you to use. That's why I personally think it's best just to focus on a couple of tools, get really good at them, know the simple things really well inside of those tools, and then you just have a process, like your own production pipeline for making artwork.
I do have a question or a comment from Cindy Loke here, who says,
Yeah.
She says it's really nice for the composition to direct and point it at the object, but sometimes I doubt myself and I worry if it seems so too on purpose to the point at the object. Does it mean as long as it looks natural, it's fine on the pointing composition?
Yeah, that's the hard part, is like not making it look too derivative to where it looks like that was like super planned out. And I think that's where that like natural quality comes from, like asymmetry, in my opinion. I think like you can get away with it if you're using asymmetry, because most things in nature like are kind of staggered, they're kind of random, and they do follow a certain ratio, like a rule of thirds and big, medium, and small. So that's like the way I try to avoid those things looking a little bit too derivative or too planned out. Because let's say, for instance, I had like, um, say this rock this rock. And this is way, way oversimplified, but like, I think this looks a lot less natural than this. And the reason why is because we're playing with those ideas of composition, right? Where I have, maybe some big shapes, big masses that are combined together into one big shape, but they're all kind of giving us direction and movement to a certain area. And also here too, like now I have small shape, medium shape, and here's, semi-medium shape, but look at all this stuff is connected together and it's like asymmetric. It's not like perfect. And, like there's a certain ratio of shapes I'm playing with. Even inside of the shapes too, it's like you have big, small, medium. So it kind of goes into everything that you're designing. But that's why when, I start designing 3D kits, I always try to model whatever kit I'm making with those ideas in mind. I don't have to adjust too much in the future later on. Okay, so we're at 1040 right now. I think I'm just going to go ahead with one of these sketches, but you guys can kind of see like where, these compositions could be pushed a little bit more in Photoshop. And right now I haven't even added color yet. So let's start diving into that because I think the composition, I'm not extremely happy with it, but it gives me a really, really good framework to kind of work from inside of Blender. So I have all of these bits, all these rocks already pre-designed. I just have to arrange them in a way that looks somewhat similar to this right here. Also, for those of you wondering what I'm doing with that foreground right there, all I did was I created a selection from these pixels and I'm using the transform tool and I'm holding Control, Alt, and Shift. And what that does is it skews that plane that those pixels are on and creates an artificial perspective on a plane. So this is like my ground plane. You can see how that kind of worked it into place a little bit more to follow that perspective grid, that imaginary perspective grid. All right, so let's organize some stuff a little bit here. I'll throw these sketches away into my bin here, into my group that I'll probably never open up again. And let's save this because I've had instances where I completely lose everything. So be safe here. We'll name this demo. Okay. I'm just going to enlarge in this a little bit. I don't really need that much resolution, but it's going to give me more space for me to paint with my brushes. So I have shadows. We'll name that. I have my background. And this is going to be my paint over layer. So just for me, I try to use acronyms, and this just helps me to organize stuff once I start getting into like, 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 layers. Just gives me something I can like look at. Instead of layer 50, I know exactly what that layer is. So I'm gonna look back at my reference here. I'm gonna pop it down again to show you guys what I'm looking at. So I'm looking at a lot of these like warm lit scenes. I'm dealing with environments that have pretty heavy atmosphere. For this project, I've noticed that the ones that have a little bit more heavy atmosphere, a little bit more moody, more mysterious, and hitting those themes that I initially had planned out in my sketchbook. So I'm definitely going for this type of feel. Also, the way the composition is set up too, with this character way off in the midground, almost background. So it does kind of play into that mysterious look, like you don't see too much of them. Gives you kind of mystery. They're going off into somewhere else. So there's something outside of the scene as well. In terms of storytelling, that kind of helps. That's all composition related. So we have those warm images, and I'm just going to cheat a little bit here. And I'm going to take one of the images I have. I'm going to throw it down into here. I create a clipping mask where this kind of just sits on top of my background layer. So all I'm trying to do right now is establish some sort of color palette. So to do a clipping mask, if you guys are wondering, all you have to do is grab a layer and whatever pixels you want that layer to be on top of and overlaying, you just go in the middle here and you hold down Alt and left click. And now all those layers or all those pixels are going to be confined to that layer that you have it clipped to. So I'm just going to paint directly on this layer. It's going to steal all these colors to paint in my background. Even some of that midground, foreground. I'm just going to throw some of this color in here just so I have something to start off with. Do this again. And I'm just going to flip this around and I'm going to abstract this one where I can just color pick and use the colors here a little bit more abstractly. So one thing I like to do with like my older pieces, or if I'm working on a project and we've already got color palettes, like the piece is already looking great, like we've already got an environment established, everything's there. I'll just take those pieces from earlier. I'll go to filter, and I think it's pixelate, crystallize, and then I bump up the cell size pretty high where I just get like these color swatches for a palette. And this really helps at this stage because, you know, I don't have to go in here and kind of guess out what colors I have. I literally have my palette right here. So now I can go into my shadows, for example, and create a new layer, create that clipping mask. I'm just going to pick some of these like warm colors that would exist here. And the shadows exist there. And some of these shadows in the foreground are definitely going to be a lot darker. They're going to be probably a little bit cooler, especially if they're in shadow. There's like a big rock behind us where everything's in shadow. Going to be a lot cooler. A new layer here. We'll paint on top.